Today, the United States and Cuba are taking the next step in restoring diplomatic relations with each other. Secretary of State John Kerry arrived in Havana this morning to attend a ceremony marking the reopening of the U.S. Embassy there. Joining him are 3 Marines who lowered the flag at the embassy in 1961, when the U.S. cut off ties to Cuba after Fidel Castro toppled the U.S.-backed government of Fulgencio Batista in 1959. These same Marines will raise the flag over the embassy. Ahead of his trip to Havana, John Kerry appeared on the Spanish-language TV network Univision and said the United States will continue to push for changes in Cuba.
I think that as we begin the process compared to the 54 years of what has been going on, which is no progress, we will begin to see a transformation take place. More people will travel, there'll be more exchange, more families will be reconnected, and hopefully the government of Cuba will itself make decisions that will begin to change things. And so I don't think you can measure a month and a half since we concluded the agreement to actually open the embassy to 54 years. That just doesn't work. Now, our spokesperson for the State Department spoke out publicly from the podium of the State Department, criticizing those people, that move on Sunday. And we will continue to speak out. Our preference is obviously for democracy, for a full embrace of the freedom of the Cuban people to choose their future. And that's what we stand for.
Also set to speak at the U.S. Embassy in Havana today is openly gay Cuban-American poet Richard Blanco, who read a poem at President Obama's inauguration after the 2012 election. Cuban dissidents will not be at the flag-raising ceremony, but Kerry says he will meet with them separately this afternoon. The New York Times reports a second flag-raising will take place at this reception, which will take place at the official residence of Jeffrey De Laurentiis, the top American diplomat in Cuba, until an ambassador is nominated and confirmed. Republican presidential candidate and Florida Senator Marco Rubio called the decision not to invite dissidents to the embassy a, quote, slap in the face. He said in a statement, quote, Cuban dissidents are the legitimate representatives of the Cuban people, and it is they who deserve America's red carpet treatment, not Castro regime officials.
Meanwhile, on Thursday, Cuban revolutionary leader, former President Fidel Castro, celebrated his 89th birthday. He met with 2 close allies, Bolivian President Evo Morales and the Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro, as celebrations were held throughout the country.
Nuestro comandante ha sido para Cuba y para el mundo entero.
Our Comandante has been a father for Cuba and the entire world. Historically, he has been a man since he was born. Today, he turns 89 years old. He has been an honest man, and all that he has done has been for the social well-being of Cuba and the rest of the world.
Well, for more, we go now to Havana, Cuba, where we're joined by Dr. Carlos Alzugaray Treto, a former Cuban diplomat who served as ambassador to Belgium and Luxembourg and head of the Cuban mission to the European Union, scholar and writer, former Havana University professor. In Washington, D.C., we're joined by Peter Kornblue, who's director of the Cuba Documentation Project at the National Security Archive at George Washington University, co-author of Back Channel to Cuba, the hidden history of negotiations between Washington and Havana. Mother Jones has just published the epilogue to an updated version of the book, which includes the secret story of how President Obama used back-channel diplomacy to normalize diplomatic relations. We welcome you both back to Democracy Now! Let's begin, though, in Havana. If you, Carlos Alzugaray Treto, can talk about the reaction right now in Havana to this day of the U.S. Embassy raising the U.S. flag over the embassy for the first time in more than half a century.
Amy, thank you for having me. It's great to be once more with Democracy Now! I think that how we're looking at it is it's trying to get an answer to the question is what kind of change this represents. Is this only a change of tactics to continue trying to overthrow the Cuban government by different means? I call it the Roberta Flack strategy, killing me softly with your song. On the other hand, maybe what we are seeing is an important change of strategy by which the U.S. now is saying, okay, there is a legitimate government in Cuba. Everybody in the world has normal relations with Cuba. We should go for that because that's how we best serve American interests in Cuba in terms of trade, exchanges, and even the interest of the Cuban-American community. I think that the American government, by sending Mr. Kerry to Cuba, who is not, he's an important political figure to Cuba to raise the flag, I think they are pointing in the second direction, the direction that they want a normal relationship with the Cuban government. And this is welcome news. I think, I mean, the flag could have been raised on July 20th. That was when the American embassy started to become an embassy, the intersection became an embassy. They could have sent an undersecretary, but they preferred to say, okay, let's wait until Secretary Kerry's very tight schedule permits for him to go to Havana and do it. And I think we appreciate in Cuba he's doing it. This is, and I want to address the criticism from Marco Rubio, I think this is an eminently intergovernmental affair. And what this situation represents is that now, with the embassy, the relationship with the Cuban government, the American relationship with the Cuban government becomes at the center stage, which is how it should be with every country in the world. Embassies are accredited to the government of the country, not to the whole civil society. They have the right to talk to the civil society, but they don't have the right to prioritize civil society, opposition civil society. That because again, here is a difference on how do we perceive civil society. But what is happening now is in the past, the U.S. prioritized these so-called dissidents. I don't like the name, and the Cuban government was not a legitimate government. Now what they are saying, yes, the Cuban government is a legitimate government, and we have to talk to them. And that's reasonable, that's pragmatic, that's the way to go, even though the differences will remain there.
Peter Kornblue, I'd like to ask you, people tend to forget that when President Obama was running for president in 2008, he was criticized then, but talked about the need for the United States to talk with its traditional enemies, to negotiate with them. And now we've seen the breakthrough in terms of Iran and of obviously the situation, the change of relations with Cuba. You talk in your piece about the back channel talks that went on apparently for years to get to the point that we are now. Could you talk about some of that, especially the role of Pope Francis, and you mentioned a group called the Trimpa Group that most Americans have not heard about?
Well, let me just say, Juan, that I couldn't agree with Carlos more. He is right on point when he says that John Kerry's presence in Cuba today is an extraordinary, important gesture by the Obama administration. There's a little nuance there, which is that Kerry had broken his leg. He'd fallen off his bike in Europe and broken his leg, and he wanted to go to Cuba when he could actually walk down the Malecon or on a Cuban street, which he will be filmed doing, I believe. And so there was a delay in his ability to go beyond his busy schedule, which involved, of course, these very tense negotiations over an accord with Iran. And, of course, Barack Obama ran for president back in 2007, 2008 on a platform of having a dialogue with our closest of enemies. And at that point, Cuba and Iran, North Korea, he was basically saying, let's engage rather than aggress. And he has really followed through on that. And the secret history of his efforts to negotiate with Cuba is now coming out. We have an extensive piece, William Leogrand and myself, in Mother Jones, the issue of September that's already arriving at subscribers' houses and is online now at motherjones.com. And it really tells a story of a commitment by a president starting all the way back in 2010 when secret talks began with Hillary Clinton's staff, 2 members of her top aides, meeting with Cuban diplomats for a 2-year period in bars in New York City and hotels in Santo Domingo and in Haiti to talk about a prisoner exchange, how to deal with the issue of these Cuban spies that were imprisoned in the United States, how to get Alan Gross, this USAID development contractor, out of a Cuban jail and back to his family in Washington. Those talks did not result in that exchange, but Obama tasked 2 top aides at the White House in 2013 after he was reelected to move forward. These negotiations were deep back channel, and they really did involve some extraordinary kind of creative initiatives, including the artificial insemination of the wife of one of the spies as kind of a tone setter, if you will, to help these negotiations go forward.
This is one of the wives of the Cuban Five.
Yes, one of the wives of the Cuban Five's, Gerardo Hernandez's wife, Adriana Perez. And that story hasn't been fully told. The Cubans actually came to the State Department with a diplomatic note saying, could you help this woman get pregnant as she approaches the age of 40, because we don't see how her husband, who's serving 2 life sentences for spying in the United States, is ever going to get out. Of course, he did get out, and when he came back to Cuba on December 17th of last year, his wife made a public appearance. She was 9 months pregnant. The world saw for the first time what had happened, and the story continues to come out of how the United States and Cuba negotiated that particular aspect of this ongoing dialogue. The Pope got involved. The secret communications with him were extraordinary, circuitous. It's a really fascinating story, but it gets down to one issue: the commitment on both sides to arrive at this point today, in which flags fly above the Cuban embassy in Washington and the U.S. embassy in Havana. They fly in what I like to say are the winds of change in the U.S. relationship with Cuba.
And Peter, could you talk about that, the Trimpa group and its role in this?
Well, of course, you know, political change doesn't come to Washington easily, and there's all sorts of creative lobbying forces that go on here every day. And unknown to most people, an extraordinary Cuban-American woman, Patty Ibrahimi, who was in Cuba, and she was on a people-to-people delegation, and she was restricted from, she had grown up in Cuba, and she was restricted even on this delegation from going around, seeing her old house and going to find her old schoolmates. She happened to have resources, and her husband donated money to the Trimpa Group, which is a Denver-based philanthropical / lobbying organization, which pairs kind of deep-pocketed donors who care about social issues with kind of a political strategy and a political effort to change social policy. And in this case, it was foreign policy. And she set out to support kind of efforts to lift the ban on travel to Cuba, which, by the way, is still in place and still needs to be lifted in its entirety. And the Trimpa Group came to Washington. They became part of a network of advocacy groups who have been working on to change Cuba policy for many, many years. The Center for Democracy in the Americas, the Washington Office on Latin America, the Latin American Working Group. I mean, organizations here in Washington that have been working conscientiously to change this policy for many, many years. But, you know, with a new kind of player in town, a new strategy, access to the White House that money brings, there was a whole kind of set of initiatives that didn't really push Obama to change his mind, but gave him the kind of political cover that he believed was needed in order to take this momentous step. And to the credit of all the players involved, and they all deserve credit, and I hope we all give them credit in the new epilogue of our book, Back Channel to Cuba, this is an extraordinary story. We don't see changes in intractable foreign policy issues like the one with Cuba very often. And this one is going to go down in history along with China, along with the rapprochement with the Soviet Union and détente with the Soviet Union, détente in the Caribbean finally. Really marks in some ways the end of the Cold War overall, and hopefully a new beginning, not just in U.S.-Cuban relations, but for U.S. foreign policy overall.
Peter Kornblue is co-author of Back Channel to Cuba, and we're going to come back to him, as well as Dr. Carlos Alzugaray-Treto, former Cuban diplomat, who is with us from Havana, where at the moment of this broadcast we are just about an hour away from the U.S. flag being raised by the three Marines who 54 years ago took that flag down in the early days of the Eisenhower and the final days of the Eisenhower administration. We'll be back with them in a minute.